asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. So I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly ordered his disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
They say that a man's house is his castle, but that's only if everyone doesn't have the keys. One of the benefits that I have as being a priest is that the parish provides a house for me here in Lancaster, and it's very nice. I certainly can't complain about the rent. But it's not the same as having your own house. I have the parish office downstairs, and people are always coming and going. The counters are there on Monday, the RCIA on Wednesday, faith formation on Thursday. People come into the door. And even when there's nothing regularly scheduled, you never know when someone might just pop in. Over the years, there's been so many keys to the rectory borrowed and so many copies of copies made that everyone in town, I think, has a key to my house. And not too long ago, I was asking someone to help me move something out of my garage into the church here. And I said, "Well, I guess I can meet you this afternoon to let you into my house." "No problem," he said. "I have a key. I'll let myself in." And also, someone was doing some work in the house recently, and I said, "Well, I'm not going to be here. I could arrange for my secretary to let you in." "Oh, no problem. My mom has a key. I'll just borrow one from her." Well, that happened so many times, and then we had some difficulty with a scouting volunteer a while back, and of course, he had a key to my house, and I said, "You know what? I'm going to change my locks. Now I'm going to control who has access to my house." And so I did. I called the locksmith. He came in, changed the locks. I wrote down the names of everyone I had given a new key to. I hid a spare key in the flower pots here outside my house in case I ever get locked out. And finally, I felt safe and secure again. And then a few weeks ago, the young man that we hired to work our Gate of Light event comes up to me and he says, "Father Matt, I was moving those flower pots around outside your house and you'll never guess what I found. It was a key." So I think it's all starting again. King David in the Old Testament had a very similar problem. Everybody had a key to his house, to his palace in Jerusalem. Guards and soldiers, wives and children, ambassadors and dignitaries were all coming and going freely. And finally, one day, King David had enough and said, "You know what? I got to get control over this situation." He said, "What I'm going to do is I'm going to appoint someone to my government. I'm going to call him the master of the palace. And I'm going to give the keys to him. And he's going to decide who has access to my house." And so he did. He found someone to be the master of the palace, and he gave him a job in the government, and he gave him the keys to the palace, and everything was great again. This master of the palace acted kind of like a bouncer at the bar, keeping the wrong people out. Or maybe better, as like the chief of staff, controlling access to the president. Well, this became an office in the government, and it lasted through the reign of many kings. And the master of the palace always had, as the symbol of his authority, the keys to the kingdom. At first, they were probably the practical keys to the palace, but over time, they became somewhat symbolic. Like you might give the keys to a celebrity who comes to town. Here are the keys to the city. They don't open any actual door, but they're symbolic. And whenever it came time for a master of the palace to retire, he would hand over the keys of the kingdom to his son, or to whoever was going to replace him as master of the palace. Well, in today's reading, we hear about a man named Shebna, who was the master of the palace under the reign of King Hezekiah. Now, Shebna, the problem with him was he was corrupt. He was not a good man. And so Isaiah today goes to Shebna and says, "Shebna, God has been noticing what you're doing. We don't really know exactly what he was doing. Maybe he was taking bribes to get access to the king, or maybe he was conspiring with the king's enemies, but he wasn't a good master of the palace. And so Isaiah says to him, Shebna, God is going to take your office away from you, and he's going to give it to a man named Eliakim. Eliakim is a righteous man, and we're going to take the keys away from you, and we're going to give them to Eliakim. And so since he has the keys, he's going to open, and no one will shut. He's going to shut, and no one will open. It turns out it's pretty important who has the keys. There was a woman who was shopping at the supermarket one day when she was getting ready to check out, and she realized, I don't know where my keys are. And she looked everywhere. She looked in her pocket. She looked in her pocketbook. Her keys were missing. And she said, oh my goodness, I bet I left them in the car. My husband's going to kill me. I'm always doing this. Over 50 years of marriage, he's always scolding me. I'm constantly leaving the keys in the ignition, and he's always afraid that the car is going to get stolen. So she finished her checkout quickly, and she went out to the parking lot, and her worst fears were realized. The car was nowhere to be found. Oh my goodness, my husband's going to kill me. And so she immediately called the police and said, look, here's where my car last was, here's the make and the license plate number. And then she made the most difficult call of all to her husband. Honey, I have a confession to make. I know you're telling me never to do this, but I left the keys in the car, and now the car's been stolen. And there was nothing but silence on the other end. And finally, the husband spoke up and said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Nobody stole your car. I dropped you off at the supermarket an hour ago, don't you remember? I told you your memory was failing. And the wife thought back and said, oh yeah, I guess you did drop me off. Well, I'm done my shopping now. Why don't you come pick me up? And he said, well, I will, just as soon as I convince these police officers here I didn't steal your car. It's quite significant who has the keys. And that's why it's so important that Jesus today gives Peter the keys to his kingdom. Just as King David gave the master of the palace the keys to the kingdom of David, Jesus says to Peter, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you will bind and no one will loose, you will loose and no one will bind. Jesus knew what he was doing when he gave Peter the keys to his kingdom. Not because Peter was the best of the apostles. He really wasn't. It wasn't that Peter was the most talented. That was probably James. He always wanted to be the greatest. He was probably the talented. Had the talent. No, Peter was kind of bumbling sometimes. It wasn't that Peter was the most intelligent. That was probably Thomas. Thomas was always analyzing things. So it wasn't him. Peter was an uneducated fisherman. It wasn't that Peter was the best businessman. That was probably Matthew. He was a tax collector. He knew how to run money. No, Peter couldn't really even keep his fishing business going very well. It wasn't even that Peter was the most holy. That was probably John, who always remained close to the Lord. Peter, as we all know, denied Jesus 3 times. So it wasn't for any of those reasons that Jesus chose Peter. It was simply a freely given gift to him, undeserved. But the one thing Peter did have going for him is that he did have a lot of faith. And he says today, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Peter knew his weaknesses, he knew his inadequacies, he knew that he was a sinner, but he also knew that God loved him. And that goes a long way in Christ's kingdom. And so, Peter was given the keys. And just like the master of the palace in David's kingdom had this office, had this authority from the king, and as the sign of his authority, he had the keys, and he was able to pass those keys on to someone else. So Peter, in the kingdom of Jesus, has a certain authority. He's not the king, but he has a certain role. And as the symbol of that authority, he has the keys, and he's able to pass those keys on to someone else. So that when Peter died as the Bishop of Rome in 67 AD, he was able to pass those keys on to Pope Linus, who passed them on to Pope Cletus, who passed them on to Pope Clement, who passed them on and on, until today we have the 266th successor of St. Peter, Pope Francis. Now, again, Jesus knew what he was doing by choosing Peter, because he is showing us that it's not by any particular talent or even holiness that the Pope has this office in the church. It's simply by the fact that he has the keys. And Jesus knew that somebody needed to have the keys, because as I found out, if somebody doesn't have control over the keys, you might as well not even have one. You might as well just let everyone in and out as they wish. And you see that sometimes in Christian churches that don't follow the authority of the Pope in Rome, that very often there's a certain chaos that happens there. If you don't like something, you go off and you found your own church, become your own Pope, and soon the unity of the body of Christ is very quickly divided. We have a tremendous gift as Catholics that we belong to the Church of Jesus Christ, the church that Jesus founded and entrusted to Peter and his successors. And there's a tremendous unity that comes from that. There's over 1 billion Catholics in the world from every nation, ethnicity, political party, ideology you can imagine, and yet we're all unified in one faith, one celebration of the Mass, because we maintain unity with each other by maintaining unity with the Bishop of Rome, with the Pope. And that's why it's so important we maintain unity with the Pope. That's one of the most important things we can do. We don't have to necessarily agree with anything the Pope says or does. The Pope is not the king of the church. Jesus Christ is the king, just as the master of the palace wasn't the king. But he does have that role of unity in the church, and so we maintain unity with him. We pray for him by name at every Mass. We should be praying for Pope Francis every day, that he lead the church well. But we also have to respect him for the office that he has, and we also have to listen to him. We certainly obey him when in those rare occurrences the Pope, in a very official way for the whole church, decides on an issue about faith or morals and says, this is what we believe as Catholics, this is the faith that's come to us from the apostles. When the Pope does that, he exercises his infallible teaching authority, and we have to obey that. But that's very rare. Pope Francis has probably never even done that. But even in his ordinary day-to-day teachings, we should at least listen to the Pope. Because the Pope has a very broad perspective. The Pope has to think of the whole church throughout the world. And we often think of things from a very narrow local or national or political perspective. But the Pope is thinking of the whole church. So we should at least listen, I think. And Pope Francis brings so much talent and gifts to the church, from his very simple way of presenting things, to his humble lifestyle, to his love for the poor and the marginalized and the sinner. He's inspired, I think, millions of people around the world, and he's really kind of transformed the conversation about the Catholic Church in a way we really needed after a lot of bad news as a church. I was in the bakery down the street here a few weeks ago, and I had my collar on, and the lady behind the counter says to me, "Oh, you're a pastor. What church are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from the Catholic Church down the street." And she said, "Oh, I'm not a Catholic, but I love your Pope. I love how he takes care of the poor." And I've heard that many times. Whenever you see an image of St. Peter, he's almost always carrying the keys. Those are his symbol. And the keys are a symbol to us as Catholics that Jesus is with his church, that Jesus doesn't abandon us, that Jesus is with us always until the end of time, and that he is very often exercising his authority through the hierarchy of the church and through the Pope. The Pope is not the king, but the Pope has that central office of unity that helps us maintain unity as Catholics. And that's why we can thank God that, unlike my house here in Lancaster, not everyone has the keys. Peter has the keys. Francis has the keys. And we can rest easy that Jesus is watching over his church, and that the house is secure, the church is secure, the kingdom is secure, for we have his promise. The gates of hell will not prevail against him.